Morena, welcome to this session on Storying the Cryosphere, Past, Present and Future. I'm Rebecca Priestley, Professor of Science and Society at Te Huna, Victoria University of Wellington, and I'm going to chair this session. First of all, a big welcome to our three speakers who have all travelled to be here at this conference. Elizabeth Leane, who is visiting from Hobart, is Professor of Antarctic Studies in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Tasmania. And Nic Low, here from Otutahi, Christchurch, is a writer and arts organiser and author of the fabulous narrative non-fiction book Uprising, Walking the Southern Alps of New Zealand, which I highly recommend. Tania Te Huna is a storyteller and writer from a few hours' drive up the Motu from the Whanganui Kuaka Collective, and she's also Billy's auntie. We were hoping to have Connie Carwell from Glacier Watch with us today, but her flight from Germany got disrupted by weather and she wasn't able to make it. So that gives us a chance to spend a bit more time with each of these three speakers who have all assured me they will have no problem using up the extra minutes. The session is called Storying the Cryosphere. To people outside of the humanities, it might sound a bit weird that we've used the word storying rather than storytelling here. But the people on this panel are more than storytellers. Collectively, they discover stories, create stories, share stories, and study stories. So this is how our session is going to go. First of all, our three speakers will each have the stage for about 20 minutes. Then we will sit together and have a discussion. So we're going to start with Elizabeth Leane, who is talking on past stories, present headlines, media culture, and public awareness of Antarctica.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you everyone for coming bright and early. It's only the most dedicated conference goers who turn up at 8:30. Very much appreciate that and really looking forward to the other speakers in this session as well. As Rebecca said, I hail from across the Tasman, from Nipaluna, Hobart. That's the traditional lands of the Muanina people, and that's in Lutruwita, Tasmania, the lands more broadly of the Palawa Pakana people. Those are people who have had relationships with the Southern Ocean and Antarctic region for millennia, as have all the Indigenous peoples living around the southern rim, including here, the Taranaki whānui. And I want to acknowledge that ongoing relationship and that they were and continue to be the first storytellers about the Southern Ocean and Antarctic region. Now, I'm here partly as a writer. I first went to Antarctica over 20 years ago as a writer in residence with the Australian Antarctic Division, but also, well, perhaps mainly as someone who looks at other people's stories. I'm a literary critic. I come from English studies, and today I'm going to talk a bit about past stories, imaginative stories from the past, and how they continue to influence present information, present headlines in newspapers, for example. So I'm going to range across literary studies, media studies, public awareness of Antarctica, and I'm going to draw on some collaborations with colleagues. I do a lot of collaborative work these days with particularly Dr. Katie Marks, who's right here, a postdoc from UTAS, and with Rebecca Priestley. So these are some of the sources that I'm going to draw on. An article recently published in Environmental Communication called Communicating Antarctica in a Changing Climate. That's by media studies scholar Linda Hunt, led by her. She's from Monash University now. A report that a group of us at UTAS did for the Australian Antarctic Division, thinking about public attitudes towards Antarctica in Australians, and my own research on Antarctica in fiction. And what that research has been really is looking at the way in which Antarctica has been represented in English language fiction over the last, say, 250 years, and trying to identify thematic clusters, sort of themes in the way that Antarctica is understood and imagined. And that's what I want to begin with. I want to take us back a little bit to the past, to the late 19th century, when the dominant way of thinking about Antarctica, you might argue, in Anglophone fiction, was as an adventure in these kinds of novels, adventure books for boys. Now, this was a time when Antarctica was a fairly mysterious place. If you look carefully, you can see not one, but two polar bears on the covers of those books. And in fact, there's another one in the Great White Land if you look inside the covers. Now, these weren't obscure books. W.H.G. Kingston, the author of At the South Pole, the earliest of these books, 1870, he was the J.K. Rowling of his day. You know, these books sold in great numbers. It was a time when literacy was on the increase, when publishing, the press was getting cheaper. People were reading these books, and people, mainly men to be honest, boys, they grew up to be the adults of the heroic era. They grew up to be people like Shackleton and Scott, who went on to write exploration narratives, influenced, perhaps subconsciously, by this early reading. Now, sometimes that becomes really explicit. And I want to give you an example of this from the archives, which I find quite amusing and also a little bit sad. This is a letter that I found in the Norwegian National Library, and it's from the managing editor of the Daily Chronicle, a UK newspaper, to Leon Amundsen, who was Roald Amundsen's brother. Roald Amundsen being the Norwegian explorer, of course, who led the first journey to the South Pole. Leon was Roald's manager as well. So this is 3 months after Roald has led the Norwegian team to the South Pole for the first time. It's a week after Roald has got back to Hobart, my hometown, and told the world that he's made that achievement. And now Leon is trying to sell the narrative of this journey to British publishers via his contact at the Daily Chronicle. And this is what he gets told, and I'll try and blow this up so you can maybe read it, and I can read it. It says, "Now in view of this competition," he's talking about competition from other books about Antarctica, "a record by a Norwegian is probably not commercially as valuable among the English-speaking races as an achievement by an Englishman or an American." So, a bit of xenophobia. And he goes on to say, "Your brother, in the course of his great achievement, does not seem to have had any exciting adventures." He was just too good. He got there too easily, apparently. Further, he says the stay in the Antarctic was short. They don't reckon there's going to be much science from it. And your brother is not, so far as we know, as were Nansen and Shackleton, an experienced and even brilliant writer. Neither Nansen nor Shackleton reached the pole, but their books, regarded both as literature and as records of human achievement, were very exceptional pieces of work. Now, Shackleton's book was actually ghost-written, but putting that aside, the point here is that your exploration narrative had to have adventure, and it had to be well told. So storytelling were absolutely paramount. So that's the adventure theme in Antarctic fiction, but there are many other themes going on at the same time. And the second one that I want to talk about is the Gothic. This is something of an older one that really comes into its own, I think, in the 20th century. But you see Edgar Allan Poe setting his only novel in Antarctica in the 1830s. You see Jules Verne, science fiction writer, writing back to Poe in the late 19th century. You see H.P. Lovecraft, a famous horror writer, with his story At the Mountains of Madness in the 1930s. And I don't know if Amy is here, but I keep on wondering if she's a relative, Amy Lovecraft, the co-organiser. But anyway, he had no children. There you go. So, yeah, it's probably a lucky escape for you, Amy. And then a story which became the basis for the film The Thing. That's from the 1930s. And then as you go into the later 20th century, innumerable horror, thriller, genre novels set in Antarctica involving scary things underneath the ice, attacking people, etc. So there's this Gothic narrative sitting alongside, overlapping with, and in some ways opposing that heroic narrative. So what we might call these themes in humanities speak are components of an Antarctic imaginary, an Anglophone one in this case, because I'm not looking at any literatures other than English. So I'm using imaginary here as a noun to mean the set of socially transmitted representations that interact with people's personal imaginings and are used as meaning-making and world-shaping devices. That phrase, world shaping, is important here because it means these imaginaries aren't just floating around fluffily being nice, they're actually influencing what happens in the world. And I like to think of an analogy here for myself. So I have an imaginary of the Amazon region. I've never been to the Amazon. I don't know anyone who's been to the Amazon, but I have an imaginary of it. And what that imaginary is, whether it's a place of danger or the Amazon is a place of adventure or the exotic or a place that's vulnerable, is going to influence my attitude towards the Amazon and maybe whether I give to a charity protecting the Amazon. And that's even more the case with Antarctica because it's that much more remote. And people live in the Amazon, but no one really lives in Antarctica in the way we understand it. Of course, people live there temporarily. No one really grows up there, so everybody goes to Antarctica with this pre-existing imaginary, which then interacts with their reality of the place. And I like to think I have a kind of vague sense of the topography of the Amazon. You know, I know it's big sort of low basin. I know there's lots of tropical rainforest, jungle. I know there's a big river. But most people don't even have that much of a sense of what Antarctica is. So it's that much more vulnerable to the imaginary. And I'll give you some data to back this up. So this is from the survey that I talked about earlier that we did of Australians back a couple of years ago. A fairly robust survey, randomised, representative of demographics and so forth. It's about as robust as you can get for a survey. And about 2/3 of Australians felt not very informed or not at all informed about Antarctica. And it turns out they were quite accurate in that self-assessment because when we asked them factual questions, this is what we got. So about 45% of Australians don't know that Antarctica comprises thick ice resting on land. 55% don't understand that the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets are the largest potential sources of sea level rise as opposed to other options we gave them like Arctic sea ice. So Australians don't have a great sense of what Antarctica is in a basic topographical way. And if you'd think that Australians, if anyone, you know, like New Zealanders should, because they're effectively next to Antarctica, you know, we have a 42% claim, we are original signatory of the treaty, we have an outsized role in Antarctic governance, but still Australians have only the vaguest idea of what Antarctica is like physically. So where do they get their information from? This is another question that we asked. And of course there were a range of answers. Documentaries were quite high, but the majority got their information from news, from television news, radio news, or written news. So Katie and Rebecca and I decided to think about, okay, well, what sort of stories are they getting in the news? How are these stories being framed? And to what extent does that relate back to those pre-existing Antarctic imaginaries? So I'm going to now segue into talking a little bit about newspaper stories. So what we did, and this is work that Katie has led, is look at ice sheets in media headlines. And we looked at headlines partly because they're easy to look at, because they're quite short, but also because they're really important. They prime the way that we read what follows. And research has shown that the headline determines what information you remember from an article and how you interpret the article. And often people only read the newspaper headlines, so there's a lot of reasons to look at them. And so what we did was a thematic analysis of headlines in the news media relating to Antarctic ice sheet instability and sea level rise. And the reason we narrowed it down to this is because all of us are involved in the humanities and social science section of Instant, which looks at ice sheet instability. And we used a standard online print media database, and we sampled Anglophone media over a decade in 3 years. So in 2013, 2018, 2023, with those keywords. And the reason that we confined it to those annual samples is that we wanted to keep the number of headlines manageable to be coded manually. So often when you do this kind of coding for what's called sentiment, generally, sentiment analysis, people will do it using some kind of software or AI. We wanted to look at nuance, we wanted to look at context and irony and figures of speech and so forth, which software is not so good at doing. And so we did it by hand, if you like. There were nearly 2,000 headlines that we looked at once we took away duplicates and letters to the editor and those sorts of things. And so we identified 10 codes, non-mutually exclusive, that we thought best covered the kinds of words and phrases that we were getting. These are the 10 that we found, and this graph here gives you a little bit of a sense of the volume of them and also trends over time. You can see the graph there represents columns for the different years, 2013, 18 and 23. This is work in progress, and we're not ready yet to really interpret this data. We're not sure whether taking this 5-year sample is enough to say anything about trends. You get interesting spikes like the one there in heroism, often because of some big event that happens that year and gets broadly covered, can skew the data. So we still need to dive into this and think about what more we can do. But today I want to think about how these different codes tie back to those pre-existing imaginaries. And so I'm going to rush really through the 10 of them before coming back to how we tie them to those imaginaries. So the first and most common one was violence, which we defined as a sudden or damaging departure from the status quo. So here, it's a good example, red alert in Antarctica, the year rapid dramatic change hit climate scientists like a punch in the guts. And almost always this violence is not human against human, it's human against environment or environment against human. Juggernaut, we use that word to describe something huge and unstoppable that is going to basically mow you down. Like this one, climate disaster is upon us. Scale was very common, often spatial in terms of how big icebergs were compared to your city or your country. Also temporal scales, financial scales, how many trillions of dollars this is going to cost us. Heroism, fairly self-explanatory, a brave and perilous effort. Here, South African teens take on the ice sheets, a bit like those brave boys in the adventure novels. Fragility, something that's vulnerable, Antarctica suffering because of burning fossil fuels. Dread, inspiring fear, the rapid loss of Antarctic sea ice brings grim scenarios into view. Uncertainty, where there's doubt in scientific or political processes, scientists disagree about drivers of temperature spike. Mystery, where we get that sense of secrets and otherworldly things, ghost of ancient river-carved landscape discovered beneath Antarctica. Hope, where there's a longing for something that you want and a confidence that it might be possible, ambitious journey to benefit science. And lastly, culpability, so blame. We are all to blame for climate change. So these are the 10 thematic clusters that we found. And what I want to point out here in the few minutes I've got remaining is the degree to which these feed from and feed back into those pre-existing imaginaries. So, for example, those themes of violence, hope, mystery, heroism are all part of that adventure imaginary. And if you go and look a bit deeper into those articles that we found, you see things like this. So this is a whole article where you can see the headline here. It's about the extraction of the million-year ice core, which is framed as a race, not unlike the race to the pole. And we get the mild-mannered Tas van Oomen here, very nice man, but here pictured from below, so really dominating the scene in the foreground, the biggest thing in the picture, holding some kind of stuff. Looks a bit like Gandalf downstairs, holding a staff, but also looks like the man on the front of Gordon Stable's The Great White Land. You can see this hero image persisting, but being transferred from the explorer to the scientist. And of course, this has concrete impact. This is a quote here from an article led by Meredith Nash, a former colleague of mine, along with Hannah Nielsen, who's here, and I think Matt King also had a hand in this. The quote says, "The pervasiveness of heroic white masculine leadership and exploration in Antarctica has meant women have had lesser access to Antarctic research and fieldwork. The image of the hero striding out into the wilderness needs to be relegated to the past." But that's difficult while this adventure imaginary is still so strong. And then this group of themes, violence, juggernaut, dread, scale, mystery, all speaks to the Gothic imaginary. And so you get articles like this one about a missing submersible which has mysteriously disappeared near the Doomsday Glacier. You know, all that language speaking to the same things that these novels like Beneath the Ice, Terror from the Deep and so forth. And of course you get lots of these in the tabloids. You know, Atlantis is found underneath Antarctica sort of monthly. But you know, you also get this in quite sober publications. And of course that too has impacts. So this is a quote from polar historian Lisa Marie van der Watt. She says, research has shown that dramatic images of carving ice shelves in the media, especially when devoid of humans, can create a distance between the observer and climate change, potentially paralysing observers' self-efficacy. And I would say that when this Gothic imaginary is deployed, that is even more the case. Because if Antarctica's otherworldly, mysterious, ancient, blah, 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 it can't really be part of your everyday life, you know, and it's not something that you're going to have any influence on. So my final point, again, a quote, this is from Noel Salazar talking about tourism, but I think it applies generally. He says, a key challenge is to recognise and identify currently dominant imaginaries and to actively create and operationalise new images and discourses that contest and replace tenacious imaginaries. Now that's easier said than done because I'm not writing those headlines, okay? Some sub-editor is, or as Nic talked to me about, maybe even a machine is writing them these days. So I can't single-handedly change an imaginary, right? But what we can do is be aware of these imaginaries and know when we are buying into them and do so deliberately if we want to for strategic purposes, or resist them deliberately for strategic purposes. So choose our words carefully, knowing how they could be framed in the future if we're talking to the media, if we're writing for the public, if we're talking to school children. Just be aware of where and when to use these imaginaries. So I'm going to end there and just encourage people to come along to the session tomorrow on communicating Antarctica for diverse audiences, where more of this media and storytelling will be discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. And a reminder, if you've got questions, please put them in the app and we will put them forward at the panel discussion afterwards. So next up we have Nic Low, whose talk is Walking Off the Map, Retracing Māori Mountain Routes Before It's Already Too Late. Thank you, Nic.
Nā te ao ko te ao tūroa tāna ko te ao maramati hei Māori ora. Nei te mihi kia koutou, te mana whenua te wahi nei tēnā koutou, te huka kaiwhakarite o te hui nei tēnā koutou hoki, he uri ahau no aoraki, tēnā koutou katoa. Friends, my name is Nic Low. It is an absolute privilege and a pleasure to be here. I'm not a climate scientist, but I'm someone who has followed climate science closely, so it is an absolute privilege to be here with you all at this conference. I think the work that you are doing is some of the most important work that's being done on the planet right now. So, tēnā koutou. I am here to talk to you a little bit about the relationship of my people, the Ngaitahu, or Kaitahu as we say in the South, and our relationship to mountains. So just before I jump into that, I just want to give you a little bit of context. Who am I? Why am I here? So I'm a storyteller, I'm an author, I've written 3 books. I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 of them today, primarily about Uprising, which is a series of journeys through the Southern Alps to explore the Māori history of those mountains. My most recent book also, Little Doomsdays, which is really about climate grief. And it's about what can we learn from previous civilizations when faced with their own demise? How do they try to project themselves into the future? What do they try to cling to? What do they love? How do they try and preserve what they love? I'm a regular contributor to New Zealand Geographic magazine. I was a contributing editor there as well, really working on how the team there can do a better job of telling Māori stories, working with Māori communities, building partnerships and relationships. I've done similar work within the arts festival world, judging literary prizes, and most recently I'm working with the Canterbury Museum to figure out how they can do a better job with their big redevelopment that's going on at the moment, how they can do a better job of telling Māori stories and honouring and treasuring the treasures that they hold. So to bring us to the mountain world, I'm from Te Waipounamu. It's a mountainous land. The backbone of our territory is ka Tiritiri o Te Moana, the Southern Alps. And everywhere we look, we see mountains on our horizon. Now, every iwi, every tribe, every hapu, every sub-tribe within Aotearoa has a sacred mountain, sometimes more than one sacred mountain that we look to, that we speak about, that those mountains are a touchstone for us in our speech, our song, our karakia. They're a marker of our identity. When we stand to speak, when I say no aoraki ahau, wa heuri ahau no aoraki, I'm a descendant of aoraki, people know immediately who I am, where I'm from. For many iwi, the bones of your ancestors rest on the slopes of those mountains. They're landmarks that identify your territory. And they're also both spiritually and literally the source of your life force, your mauri, your wairua, the waters that flow off those ancestors that come down through the lakes, through the rivers, out to the coast. That is what sustains your people, both in spirit and in practice. So, having grown up with that general imaginary, to borrow a term, that mountains hold these roles for us, I wanted to think about what were the specific stories and specific relationships that we hold to some of these mountains. Now, within my part of the world, so my whakapapa, my genealogy takes me down to the very southwest of this land, and the very south, so Murihiku. And this is a kind of representative image. Has anyone spent time here in Fiordland? Quite a few of you. So sheeting rain, heavy-duty glaciation, it's an extremely rugged and remote landscape. In the way that we think about wilderness, this is what we think about. Now, on my Pākehā side, on my European side, we're mountain people. There are several generations of us that are mountaineers, that love the mountains, and I grew up knowing those stories. On my mother's side, on our Kaitahu side, we're ocean people, we're coastal people, we're sea people. So I did not have any vision of ourselves and our history amongst places like this, down in the mountains, in those really remote fjords, and right through the Southern Alps as well. I never understood us to have a relationship to those mountains. And that's a really common practice. That's a really common way of thinking about it. The saying is there were no Māori in the mountains. You know, they were never there. We're a coastal people. We're confined to the coast. The mountains stand there on the horizon. The thing that got me interested in going deeper than that was actually a tohu. I was sitting at my desk working, and something caught my eye out of the window. And I looked up, and it was Aoraki and his brothers. It was these enormous snowy mountains. And if you're a lover of mountains, you know that lifting feeling you get in your chest when you see real mountains. That was the feeling that came over me. But I kind of I cracked myself up because I was actually in Australia at the time. I was in the kind of red, dusty plains of Western Victoria, and what I'd seen was an approaching storm front. It was a set of thunderheads coming across the plains, but that was the tohu for me, that the mountains were calling, and I wanted to learn more. So I went to one of my mates who works at Ngāi Tahu in the archives department, Takare Norton, and I said to him, what history do we have in the inland plains, in the high country, in the mountains? You know, do we have anything? Were we ever there? And he just kind of laughed at me, and he brought up a satellite image like this. So this is how you might imagine a map of pre-European New Zealand to look in terms of place names and geography. It's just a blank map, right? Well, then he pulled this up. So this is just a tip of the iceberg of the pre-European place names that sit over what we might consider one of the more remote wildernesses of the world. This comes from Ngāi Tahu's cultural mapping project. This is decades of work mining oral histories, old maps, archives, everything that we could find within the tribe to collate all the pre-European place names. Every single name on there has deep connections. It speaks of an intimacy with that land. These place names have ancestors associated with them. There are physical traces there. There's archaeology. There are food gathering sites. And this is just the ones that we've retained and been able to find. So the intimacy that this shows to me was really kind of transformational. If anyone's interested in this, I'm aware that some of you are going on a field trip. There's going to be a trip down to Te Waipounamu. There is a publicly available version of that. The main cultural map has approaching 7,000 traditional place names. There are about 1,000 on this public version, Ka Huru Manu, so just grab the link there if you're interested. But what Takare showed me was also this layer on the map. Those glowing green lines, those are the pre-European trails that go through the mountains, that cross from one side of the Southern Alps to the other. And when he showed me that, I thought, could I walk those trails? Like, what would happen if I tried to walk those traditional trails today? Where would I end up? So this became something of an obsession. Over roughly the next decade, I worked with our tribal historians, elders, archivists, archaeologists, scientists from a range of different backgrounds to gather as much information as I could about our relationship with these mountains. And then I kind of loaded all of that information in my pack and I took it for a walk. I did 15 crossings of the Southern Alps over that period, and sometimes by myself, sometimes with big family groups, with experts, and just want to share a couple of the things that I learned along the way. So this is one of my favourite journeys because this was done right down in my home part of the world, Pio Pio Tahi, Milford Sound. There is a very rare type of pounamu, which is called tangiwai. We call it takiwai. It is a bowenite. It is glass-like, transparent, exquisitely beautiful, and it's pretty much only found in 2 places. And one of those places is in our part of the world. Now, the journey that we did was to gather takiwai from its source, where we have the ancestral rights to collect the stone, and to bring it 300 kilometres back through the traditional inland route back to our home marae on the south coast. Took us just under 3 weeks, about 30 of us involved in the journey. So we had to collect the stone off the beach. We had to do battle with the namu namu. Those of you who are heading to Te Waipounamu will get to meet our friends, the sandflies. I wish you luck. We had to load the stone that we gathered into sea kayaks. We kayaked Milford Sound. Has anyone walked the Milford Track here? Yeah, a number of you. It's one of the most beautiful and popular walks in the world. It looked a bit like this for us, but the privilege of that was the track had flooded. There'd been serious flooding. Everyone had been helicoptered off the track. So when we walked it backwards, and we could just wait for the rivers to go down just enough to get across and start walking. We had the track to ourselves. No one else on it. It was remarkable. When we got to the other side, our cousins met us with the waka ama boats. So we had big crews out on the lake paddling. We took them across the inland lakes. We had a support boat with us with the old people there. The elders were able to come too on the support boat. We had the young ones on the support boat too, so they can jump in the waka, have a paddle, get tired, jump out. So it was a really big whānau affair. It wasn't without its challenges. We did have to move some mountains, but our karakia game is strong. We were able to overcome those challenges. And here we are descending towards the coast to return the stone, or to gift the stone to our marae, where it still sits in our treasure cabinet there today. We look back through the archive, through the memories that people had, and the last time that we think that this journey was done on that inland route was 1838. So it was a real privilege to get our people together and reconnect with those landscapes, take us back out into the mountains, and just start rekindling some of those fires. When I write about this in the book, it's very much a personal account. The first version of the book that I wrote was nearly 200,000 words. It was a doorstop. My editor, when I submitted it to him, looked utterly terrified. He was trying to be diplomatic. I don't know, those of you who are writers, when you work with your editors, you know that they're often quite delicate. Like, they don't want to offend you. Whereas I could see him thinking, holy crap, what am I going to do with this? I think he used the word bamboozled. So what I tried to do was write a really deep, dense, detailed history book. And frankly, no one, or a very, very select number of people would have read that book. There was nothing of me in there. There was no human scale. So what we did is basically threw that version of the book out and started again and wrote it as a personal, first-person narrative where I'm your tour guide, come on a journey with me. We're going to walk these trails. We're going to see the landscape through my eyes. And I think I raise this in the context of this conference because what those of us in the humanities are trying to do is to communicate the urgency and the importance and the scale, both on a large scale, but also on a personal and a human scale. So I think by putting it into the first person, there's a love story in there. Spoiler alert, it's how I meet my partner and where our son comes from, though I'm not going into detail on that. But it's also, I think, because, in a way that you heard earlier, it's about fighting stories with stories. Many of the people's imaginary about how our people were not in the mountains, that we had no presence in the inland high country and mountains, they didn't learn it from reading detailed history books. It's an ambient set of stories that get told in many different forms over time. So this way of fighting stories with stories, for me, I guess, is kind of what gets me out of bed. Now, I just want to move to the question of our relationship with the high mountains, with snow and ice, and the question of just how high did we go? We know we were in the ballpark. We were often in and around the mountains, but did we actually go up into the snow and ice? And I'd never heard stories about it. No one I'd spoken to really had any sense that had been done. But there are some specific oral histories that talk about it. So my brother Tim and I retraced a journey of a woman called Hene Tamatea and her two sons called Marupeka and Tata Whaka. They discovered a route that's now known as Copeland Pass, a really popular transalpine route back in the day. So we decided to retrace that route to try and get a feel for how we might have travelled in the mountains. And so part of that process was looking for evidence of our presence in the high alpine. So firstly, you got that accepted wisdom, no Māori in the mountains, but we do have documented use, widespread use of all the accessible passes from one end of the island to the other. And the only way that you know about all the accessible passes is by exploring everything. And there are lots and lots of oral histories within the tribe of people going and exploring. You have sources of stone. Within some of the earliest archaeological records, there are sources of stone found that are only found above the bushline. So very early exploration into the alpine zone. We have oral histories, we've got named ancestors, we've also got language. We don't have anything like the sophistication of other cultures when it comes to describing snow and ice, but we do have words for different types of ice, for glaciers, snowfields, neve, for avalanches, also for little sloughs, just small avalanches. Things that suggest a knowledge and a familiarity. We've also got gear. So the work that I've been doing recently at the museum has been awesome because it gives me access to the catalogue to just go and look up all the things, and seeing all the pre-European gear and comparing it to the gear that we were using for a relatively straightforward transalpine route. Like you'll see here in the photo, here's Tim descending on the east coast side of the pass. It's a romp in snow. So we used an ice axe. You would walk with a toko, with a walking staff, often with a sharpened pin on the bottom, pretty much a glacier axe. You would carry a toki, used for cutting trees, but also we've got documented evidence of steps being cut in extremely steep earthen banks. European explorers found fixed ropes on vertical cliffs, wooden pegs hammered into the cliffs as pitons or as footholds. And modern tests on replicas of pre-European flax rope show that they're almost as strong as modern climbing rope. So the gear was up to the task. So taken together, there was no sense that we were regularly travelling in the mountains, but that on certain occasions we were there and that we did have that relationship, that we were in and around and among our sacred mountains in meaningful ways. And so we did go into the snow and ice. We did have that disconnection. There's a long history of colonisation, of removing our people from that inland and high country. I don't have time to go into it now, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the reconnections that are going on. So we have got some initiatives. This was a really cool program run in partnership with a guiding company called Alpine Recreation. If any of you are mountaineers and looking for guiding, I can highly recommend them. They've been very supportive of our tribe. they ran a program where 4 young ngaitahu every year went up into the snow and ice, got taught how to use crampons and axes, and just to spend a few nights sitting in a hut underneath Aoraki, talking with the mountain guides about our various relationships with the mountain. We also have a program called Aoraki Bound. It's on pause at the moment because of COVID. There's talk of it coming back, but it's a boot camp for emerging leaders, and the centrepiece of that is a journey through the mountains on one of these ancestral routes. So it's something that really inspires our people to get right up close to our ancestor mountains, to not just say it in speech, but to actually, here's a couple of my relations standing underneath Aoraki, and just, you can kind of see it on their faces, what it means to be there in that place. When we did that walk, the one that I mentioned earlier, when Tim and I went and crossed Hine Tamatea's route, not only were we looking for information about how high into the snow and ice we went, we'd also been given a challenge by the local Kati Mahaki people. So from South Westland, the Aoraki Bound program always crosses an alpine pass. And they wanted to know, would it be possible for that program to cross Ngoti Hine Tamatea? This is a route that their ancestor discovered, that their people have a long association with. They wanted to know, could we take this group of relatively novice hikers on this route? So up until the point where we got over the pass, absolutely. That was absolutely within their capabilities. But when we got onto the other side of the pass and started the descent, this is what it looks like now. And I think I don't need to tell anyone here in this room about down-wasting and glacial recession. You're probably some of the best people in the world to understand what is actually going on here. But when it comes to taking novice trampers on this kind of terrain, down climbing unstable marine walls is pretty much no one's idea of a good time, and frankly, just thinking about the health and safety plan was enough to put me off. So this route that the Kati Mahaki people have many, many hundreds of years of association with, that route is done. It's over. With very few exceptions, people with actual mountaineering experience, they can give it a crack, but even that's risky. So these are some of the, I guess, lesser-known consequences of the impact that climate change is having on ka tiritiri o te moana, and there are other examples of this as well I don't have time to go into here. But what I want to leave you with is what I think is the biggest symbolic challenge, the way to visualise what is at stake here for us. I opened with the tauparapara that I began with is just a little snippet from a longer karakia that comes from Matiaha Tiramore, who are a very significant figure in our history. And it gives a genealogy of the creation of the world. And Aoraki, the mountain that you see, is the firstborn son of the sky father in our cosmology. We say Aoraki Matatu. We say Aoraki of the uplifted face. When we look upon his face, we are seeing the face of our ancestor, of our grandparents, of our grandchildren. He is hugely significant to us. So my question, and I guess my challenge to all of you, is, those of you with the skills to do the modelling, those of you with the skills to visualise what Aoraki is going to look like, what is he going to look like in 50 years' time? When these glaciers that you see here, these hanging glaciers, when they're gone or when they've changed, what is Aoraki going to look like? When we look upon his face, what are we going to see? This is our ancestor mountain. This is the national mountain of Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is the highest peak in the country. I think if we can produce visuals and modelling that shows what is going to happen to Aoraki, he's rock held together by ice. You know what our mountains are like. They're extremely fractured. When the ice melts, what happens? So if there's anyone here who has the skills to visualise or model that, or knows someone who does, I would love to hear from you. I think that images of Aoraki as he might be in the future could be a really powerful motivating force. So I will leave you with that. If you'd like to get in touch, there's my email address. If you're interested in the books, I've run out of time to talk about Little Doomsdays. Maybe we can touch on that in the session later. But yeah, get in touch if you would like to. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you so much, Nic. So next up, we've got Tania Te Huna, who is talking on local stories, global narrative, building intimacy at the intersections.
Ka pai tēnā tātou. Taku manuku a ka pai ere tangata. Taku manuku a ka tui tiki te raukura. He manu rere runga, he manu rere raro. He manu rere ki ngā tōpito te ao. He manu wātoro, he manu wakata. He manu, karaka me te mae. Hai. Ko te mariki runga, te mariki raro, mauri oro ki a tātou katoa. E rere kau mai te awa nui mai te kāwi maunga ki Tangaro, ko au te awa, ko te awa ko au. My ancestral river flows from the mountains to the sea. I am the river, and the river is me. Kia ora everyone, yes, my name is Tania Te Huna. But internationally, I'm getting known as Auntie Tans, and I'm happy with that. So, Auntie Tans, kia pai. So, I'm going to start off with a bit of a reading, and it's a potential podcast in the making. So, I want you all to buckle up, because I'm going to take you on a flight with AJD. The earth is hardening. The trees are entering into their dormancy phase, and the chill in the air is starting to bite at their bones. The natural cycle of the earth, that is nature, is moving into another stage. The kuaka are restless. Their internal radar is beeping like a microwave timer. Kuaka have heard this timer on more occasions than they can remember. A sign. Like being at the airport and hearing your flight to board the plane. Last call. It is time to leave here to follow the next summer. About 17 years ago, a lot of kuaka flew into Alaska with little white tags on their legs that had letters on them. AJD was one of those manu. The other kuaka were curious as to what this alien thing was that had attached itself to their brother's leg. They peeked at it. Nothing. Perhaps it might blow away with the wind. It didn't. After a while, they all lost interest in the little white tag, as did AJD. Life carried on. The kuaka in the southern part of Alaska would have already departed. The ground would be frosting, a sign that winter is right on their doorstep. Our manu in the north will be the last to leave before their planes are blanketed in its white cloak. AJD and his partner have been blessed with another good flock this season. The nest is abuzz with the chitter-chatter of little ones. It is also an anxious time for AJD and his love. In a few days, they will fly off and leave their young to fend for themselves. The nestlings will still need to feed to build up enough fat to sustain their journey. They need all the sustenance they can muster. Mum and Dad will not be there to hold on to their wings for this, their first ever adventure. While the older chicks may fly off with their parents, the younger ones stay on until they have eaten their fill or until the food source is all but disappeared due to the winter season creeping in. They will fly up to 12,000 kilometres non-stop and under 2 weeks to arrive in Aotearoa when they are only 3 months of age. That is insane. Jet planes until recently couldn't even fly that far for that long. I believe they are a breed of super manu. Like Superman, they have super sight. According to the experts, hang on, I'm just finding myself. According to the experts, kuaka can not only see the electromagnetic fields of the earth, they are guided by them. That is crazy, right? Why are we not raving about them all the time? Where are the TV advertisements, the movies, the children's shows and documentaries? Just like us, I'm sure they have their very own oral histories. The chicks would ask, who made the first flight and what did they see? AJD tells his young how his great-great-grandfather told him of how a man followed them to Aotearoa. The man was in a vessel that sat on the water. At night when it was all dark, the man would have followed the cries of the kuaka as they changed guard, or listening to the flapping of their wings. Especially on those nights there was no moon. As the years passed, more and more vessels were spotted by the kuaka, vessels that flew higher in the sky than the manu could see. But they heard them. More and more vessels of all shapes and sizes on the water. The weather was changing. The winds were carrying some of the manu, of course, and some never returned. AJD and friends can only follow the path that has been set by their tupuna. All the males have bronzed up their chests. They have all eaten as much as they can possibly eat, waiting for the perfect southerly. Their superpowers are charging up. They start their calling slowly, quietly, one after another. They start their trilling, darting around, scavenging for another little morsel. The older kuaka fighting for that soft-shelled crab, that tasty little worm, poking and prodding at the mud for just one more bite. The southerly is finally at the right speed for them to fly into. This is it. AJD uses his beak as his antenna to test the winds. With the right wind, he knows that he can fly at speeds of up to 100 kilometres per hour. AJD needs that good start because they have a long way to go. The most experienced male will lead them out. The rest of the boys will fly on the flanks of the flock and rotate around. Whoever is at the front has the hardest job. He is head on with whatever flies his way. They are building up their resilience because this is the first stage of a round trip. Whilst the females and younger kuaka are all snug in the middle, they still have to flap those tiny little wings of theirs the whole way. These little babies literally cannot stop flapping those wings if they are to successfully make it to summer camp. Like other seabirds or shorebirds, kuaka don't have waterproof feathers. They can't rest on the water. They have to keep flying until they reach their preferred destination. Water, 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 rotate, flap, 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 so tiring. What is driving these manu to do these enormous, long, exhausting journeys? Is it their internal ancestor or something else? Departing from Alaska and down past the Gulf of Alaska, the base temperature is still quite cool. As they start to enter into the Pacific Ocean, they will feel the warmth from the surface of the water, 11,500 kilometres to go, and all they will see will be water. Okay, they will reach the shores of Aotearoa, and even though it may take up to 10 days, their main focus, besides building their strength back up, will be returning to their favourite and preferred estuary. I suppose if we have a favourite restaurant, the kuaka do as well. Whatever the reason, it is not for us to wonder why, but simply to acknowledge that it is so. This is not the first round trip for AJD, but he is on his way. He is ready. Okay, unbuckle the seatbelts and let's go for more of a journey. All right, so AJD is a kuaka, a bar-tailed godwit, or a lamosa laponica, if you're a geek. that has been departing from our ancestral river, Te Awa on or around March the 25th, religiously, for the last 17 years. AJD was tagged in 2008 at the Manawatu Estuary, a few rivers south of Wanganui. A white flag with the 3 letters AJD in black was placed on his upper right leg, easily identifiable with a pair of binoculars. After landing in Foxton each year, he returns to Wanganui until his migration back to Alaska. It wasn't until about 2013 that a man by the name of Paul Gibson started to notice that AJD had been arriving and departing from the same place about the same time each year. He started taking more notice, noting dates and times and taking hundreds of photographs. As the incredible story emerged from his observations, Paul was inspired to write a book about this manu. This is that book, Feats Beyond Amazing, the life story of a bar-tailed godwit. My introduction to this kaupapa, this project, started off innocently enough. My nephew Billy asked me to compose a waiata, a song about this manu, back in 2023. I knew absolutely nothing about these manu. After first meeting Paul and his wife Jane, we then had to arrange a meet and greet with AJD. Odd to feel so excited about meeting an individual manu, but he did not disappoint. Shortly after meeting him, AJD migrated back to Alaska. I'm hooked on his story and I tell it everywhere I go to anyone who will listen. So make sure to listen, and I mean like really listen. Our audience constantly changes, and so our mode of storytelling changes too. It's a big story, so we often focus telling the parts that we know are sure to excite. We think our Indigenous knowledge traditions and our ways of telling stories are really good at that, setting intention and inspiring action. My first task was to find the stories as they've already been told. I went through the normal channels of asking our iwi tribal knowledge holders and storytellers before heading over to our iwi archives. Surprisingly, there was little in the way of local stories of kuaka. So I went to our local queer, our beautiful queer, and a very, very respected elder, and sought her advice. She immediately saw the importance of AJD's story and encouraged me to look more widely at other tribal narratives and use my skills as a composer and storyteller to ensure our people knew our story of AJD and how he connects us and our river to the world. My focus then turned to composing waiata, song that can become embedded in our tribal narratives and identity. First, I translated a poem that Paul composed in his book, and then sought one of our musicians to put a tune to it. By the time AJD was ready to migrate in March 2024, we had a waiata that we could sing to send him on his way. It was also the first time in his recording years of departing from Wanganui that AJD and friends left 5 days late. While we thought it could be Billy's singing that put them off, it was more likely the unfavourable winds that had made it impossible for them to reach their feeding grounds in East Asia. The musicians in our group have since composed another waiata, Te Tania Te Huna, the call of the godwit, and our kaumātua Kapahakaropu, an elders performance group, have taken up this waiata to not only sing it, but to teach it to our community. We've taught this at every opportunity with our collaborators in China, Canada, Australia, Korea, and with our Alaskan whanaunga. Perhaps unsurprising, the Koreans have latched onto this waiata, composing their own Korean language version that expresses a longing for kuaka to return to the Suda tidal flats, the migratory bird habitat that has been changed drastically by development. We're also engaging more contemporary modes of storytelling to target those communities who cannot engage in Māori language and oratory practices. Cool. I have embedded the narrative of AJD in a bilingual children's book that importantly is a local story about a local kuaka written by a local person. The main title is Kuaka ki te ao, or Godwits to the World. This is the first in a series and is subtitled AJD, the Bar-tailed Godwit. Keeping it local at this point, but with space to connect with other strands of the wider global story. A work in progress and actively looking for collaborators. We have also just recently completed a short documentary film. This film is not just about AJD, but about how he is inspiring connections and collaborative action across his global range. As we continue to tell the story of AJD and connect it with stories from other parts of his vast range, the story continues to compel and guide us in our action on biodiversity conservation and on climate change. Most recently, I've found out that their calls can vary depending on where in their global range they are, from which I have composed the following wakatoki, a proverb. Ko te kuaka he reo tōna ki pai tāwiti, he reo tōna ki pai tata, e Māori kōrero ki te mana o te whenua. Whether near or far, the call of the kuaka is an expression of the essence of his landscape. Whether the kuaka are calling here in Aotearoa, in their feeding grounds in East Asia, or in their breeding grounds in Alaska, their calls are an expression of the life force of our landscape and of our awa, our river. So we will close with a waiata, the waiata I talked about, Te Tania Te Kuaka, which acknowledges the relationship of our kuaka that migrates the globe from Alaska to Aotearoa to our sacred river in Whanganui, bringing people together.
Te tangi a te kuaka,
kuaka, te tangi a te kuaka, kuaka. Re re taku manu i te rangi ki te ao, ki tā witi nui, ki tā witi pāmama, hoki mai e taku manu kuaka, ki ngā tai o te wainui arua, te tangi a te kuaka, kuaka, te tangi a te kuaka, kuaka. Re re taku manu i te rangi ki te ao, ki tā witi nui, ki tā witi pāmama, hoki mai e taku manuku aka, ki ngā taio, te wainui arua, ki ngā taio, te wainui arua. Can you hear their call? How might you respond? How does your story connect with ours? Kora taku mo tēnei wā, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa.
Thank you, that was beautiful, thank you. Now I'm going to invite all the speakers to come up and sit in the chairs here, and let's just give a big thank you to all our fabulous speakers this morning.
This is directed towards Nic. It's no surprise to me as an Indigenous person who is really familiar with our place names for things. One of my elders had told me that because we live and love the land so much, we have to give it a name. So that graphic of your people's place names for those locations through those passes in the Southern Alps is no surprise to me. What I wanted to ask was how you're going to incorporate that research into another book. I know you talked about this big compendium of all these stories. So are you going to be able to write that or segments of that in other books?
Thank you for the question. It's something that was really front of mind for me was how to speak to different audiences and different things being useful in different ways. So the gathering of all that kōrero, all those conversations and that archival work has found lots of different homes. So the book itself has a lot of those stories woven into it. With each specific area, like often when I would walk a particular route, I would focus on an ancestor, someone who was associated with that. So that involved working with the home people from that area. And so I would give them all my research so that they could use it however they wanted to use it. We have a tribal magazine called Te Karaka. So I wrote stories about some of the specific areas, sort of where I could kind of go into depths about some of the things that were important to us that maybe a broader audience might not respond to. But that great weight of research, it still sits there. I suppose, yeah, it's I haven't really revisited the vast bulk of it because I suppose I wanted to write for as big an audience as I could, and I wanted to write something accessible. I felt like a lot of our people would not pick up a 200,000 word book. So yeah, I don't have an answer for the film. Oh, all right.
Nic, I just wanted to follow that up. When I saw that image, I was struck that there were many more place names in the map, in the mountainous regions, in the fjordlands, than in the plains. Is that an artefact of what you've been able to collect, or does that reflect a naming practice? Or
I should just qualify that I haven't personally collected those names. This is a huge effort across several generations to collate all of those names. But a lot of it, there are many different layers to why we have names and more names in some areas than other. My sense is that the names were the most dense areas with that density was pretty consistent, particularly through the plains and around the coast. They do get a bit more sparse in some of the mountainous areas, but a place like Fiordland, Te Roa Te Moko, was really heavily traversed and settled, and there's actually going to be a lot more information coming about this. Gerard O'Regan, who is one of our leading archaeologists, he has just landed a really big funding grant, 4 years worth of research funding, to go and do an amazing systematic survey of Fiordland, looking for cave art, looking for our rock art, and that's going to involve visiting a huge number of these places and kind of bringing them to light. The plains themselves, as to why there aren't so many names known for there, I'm not so sure about that specifically. Kia ora.
Thank you, and I do have a lot of questions in the app. Thank you all. Sorry I didn't see that immediately. I've got one for you, Auntie Tan, from Tumanako. As the Kuaka left 5 days later due to winds, this was a couple of years back, and I think that was the year I was up there as well, saying farewell. Are you seeing their environmental decision-making elsewhere? Are there changes in other parts of their journey that you're aware of?
According to Paul, he is the one that has been watching, observing this manu for 17 years. No, that was the first time. That was the first time ever for probably the lower part of the North Island. We did actually hear back from Marinda, the Pukorokoro seafood thing up in the Firth of Thames, and I think they posted up on their page about the fact that, yeah, a lot of them, even from the South Island, were late that particular year in 2024 due to, I think there was a tornado or something around, yeah.
Thank you. And so we've got a question from the audience.
Yeah. Hello. Hubertine Witches. I'm also from the Antarctic Society for Auntie Tania. What an incredibly beautiful, moving way of telling a story. And it's so effective, I think, cross-cultural as well. So I think that the world would be a better place with more stories, the way you're telling them. And, well, also the other thing is we tell stories of the Antarctic Society via our Antarctic Film Festival. And we will be visiting you with Billy as the centerpiece in Whanganui. So we are really, really looking forward to seeing you there again and to hear Billy's story as well. So thank you so much. It's wonderful.
We look forward to hosting you and sharing, and showing you how we do it up in Whanganui.
Thank you. We've got another question from the audience here.
Yes. My name's John Howell. I'd like to pick up on Elizabeth's very interesting presentation. I took it out that your analysis of the stories was around adventure. But it seems to me that there's the theme of hero worship as well. And there's a very interesting obituary of the author who started to demythologise Robert Scott in today's paper. So the hero worship has been followed by some really critical analysis of Scott. And that's in the English setting. But in New Zealand, our hero is Edmund Hillary. And I wondered if you'd like to comment about the influence of Hillary. And the other question I've got for you is, is there a significance of Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner?
I'll start with the easy one. Yes, very much so. In English, I think The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, I mean, it's the earliest account in English of the Antarctic written after Cook's voyage. So it actually deals with Antarctica or the Antarctic region as a known place. It's a Gothic ballad. It's about a ship crewed by zombies, essentially, that goes down to the Antarctic and has all kinds of terrifying adventures and is followed by a spirit of the South Pole back to the Northern Hemisphere. That established, well, it didn't establish, but it drew on an existing Gothic imaginary, but really popularised it. And although people probably might not know the poem, I'm sure you'll know lots of lines from it, like water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink, and those kinds of lines which enter our language. So yes, Coleridge I just couldn't put it up on the screen because it didn't have a good picture. Yes, the hero looms very large in the Antarctic imaginary. I mean, heroes feature in all kinds of different genres, not just the adventure novels. So, you know, thrillers have heroes and horrors have heroes. And so I think the adventure hero is a particular kind of hero, but one that's been really dominant. And so were you talking about Roland Huntford's, was that what was in the newspaper? Yeah, so, I mean, the whole story of Scott is a very complex one, and the different reputations of different explorers like Scott and Shackleton Amundsen, which have arisen and fallen over the years. And I think Hillary can probably be put in that same category, that you often get a first stage of hero worship followed by a stage of revisionism. I'm not quite sure, I'm not familiar enough with the New Zealand context to comment directly on Hillary. But what I think is interesting is the way in which, I think rather than, I mean, I'm not such a fan of the debunking of the kind of that Roland Huntford did, but I prefer the fighting stories with stories. As in, rather than debunk Scott and show what an idiot he was, which usually takes things far too far the other way. I don't personally think Scott was an idiot. It's much more interesting to tell other stories, to tell the stories of the men with Scott, and then tell the stories of the men that Scott took who were Russian Indigenous people with him, you know, and these kinds of stories. So I think for me, there are many different kinds of heroes, and we need to get away from just one hero, which is essentially a white man in Antarctic history, and tell the story of other heroes.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on that and take from a question posed by Mawera in the app about the lack of Indigenous voice in history in the literature that you've studied out. But this is really a question for everyone. Where do you see acknowledgement of Māori as possibly first explorers to Antarctica? Have you come across anything in your literature search?
When I first wrote Antarctica in fiction, that was one of my big anxieties, was that I knew there must be a literature out there from people in the Southern Rim, and I had a lot of trouble finding sources. And all I could find was the story of Huite Rangiora, which someone spoke about earlier. And all I could find was a 19th century account by Percy Smith, and you know, it was very difficult. And what's really pleased me is that there's been so much more attention to those stories in the Māori context recently. And I was mentioning this to Billy because with Priscilla Wahey, he's published some articles about that, and there's been some others written by Ngāi Tahu, and there's a really interesting contestation going on around that story, and you know whether it was a story about a journey to Antarctica or the ice, and etc. What I haven't seen a lot of is corresponding work being done in the bottom of South America, which is very close to Antarctica. The Yagan people, the Ona people, would have had many stories of the region to the south, but I haven't seen a lot of work being done there. And in my own state of Tasmania, again, the Palawa people, there was an article that came out a couple of years ago about a story of the South Pole star. And most people will probably know there isn't a visible South Pole star at the moment, but there was 10,000 years ago because of the precession of the Earth's axis. And there's a story from Palawa people about an unmoving star in the sky. So that story has stuck around since, 10, 12,000 years ago. The first story, I think, of the South Pole in the sky, the celestial South Pole. And yet almost nobody's heard of it. So, and those are not my stories to tell. And I was saying to Billy, there's a man called Cohen Hurd, who's a Palawa man who's pointed some of this out, but there's much more work to be done. And I'd love to see that happening in other places as well as in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
And Nick, what about in your explorations of the Kaitahu archives? Have you come across any stories there or
I haven't been looking further south than Murihiku. The point that we go to is the Titi Islands. We have a tradition of maikakai, of food gathering of the Titi. The sooty share water, and the islands off the coast are sort of the extent of our range. But there have been finds on some of the southern islands that are within New Zealand's remit. adzes that have profiles that match them to Aotearoa. So there are clearly connections, there were clearly voyages there, and Athol Anderson has done a lot of work on this. I won't attempt a botched summary of his extremely complex work in this context, but I'd recommend looking at his work on starburst migration, on the process of arriving in a place and then immediately or contiguously parties heading off in all directions, and this sort of process of crossing Te Moana Nui a Kiwa and heading south. And around the time of the settlement of Aotearoa, people arriving and heading off in all different directions, and we know people went south. How far south they went, I think, is, like you were saying, there's a lot of debate about that, and what the oral histories are saying, matching that up with the geography, is a sort of an ongoing conversation.
Can I just add that? I mean, for me, I don't think it really matters who got to Antarctica first and so forth. What matters is that people have had relationships with this place for so long. So I think we've got to give up talking about who was first to the ice, which is just not a useful way of thinking.
Yeah, continuation of those same colonial narratives of who planted the flag.
Yeah. I want to come back to something you said at the end of your presentation, Auntie Tans, about can you hear the call of the kuaka? And, we could take that literally or more sort of metaphorically. And taking it literally, I thought about, I was in Singapore just the week before last, doing some research into a narrative I'm writing about sea level rise, and looking at the coastal protection they're doing in Singapore, spending billions of dollars on it. But at the same time, there are some wetland areas in Singapore, and I went to visit one of them to see what sort of the natural coast was like with mangroves and so on, and wetlands and marshes. And I wasn't expecting it, but I saw there the sign, Bar-tailed Godwit, that this was one of the places that they stop in. So it was beautiful to see that connection point. And can you just tell us a bit about how the kuakas helped you connect with, with new people and places?
I think it all started off when Billy and another one of our collective, they went over to Alaska, and Estelle, our Alaskan whanaunga, kind of met them there, and something that they said had really, really resonated with her. So she kind of reached out and she listened to our story about our local manu, about AJD. And I think she stated something the other night, Monday night after her movie, regardless of all the disaster that's happening around the world, and namely Alaska, she goes, people don't see other people in disaster, but they will do whatever they can to save the birds. So her thing to us was, she said to us, okay, we're going to take this bird, we're going to take this manu, AJD, we're going to take him to the world, and we're going to make him the rock star. He is just there as the visual, but the story behind his travels is all about the climate change and the biodiversity and all the rest of it like that. So sometimes people overlook the real story, but if you put something that's pretty and dainty and, it kind of appeals to them, that's what we are trying to draw the people in to the kaupapa, to actually really, really see what this bird is about. So it's kind of, we give these exciting little tidbits. It's like giving everyone, taste this hors d'oeuvre, It's just a tiny little smidge. But the feast, the hakari, is just beyond that door. And we are always holding that door open.
And Ali and Nick, have you had any connections, experiences with kuaka?
We were just a couple of weeks ago, we were at Okarito, down in Te Waipoinamu on the west coast. There is a mighty lagoon there, an estuary that has an extremely rich bird life. It's part of migratory passages, and we were kayaking around the lagoon. We'd gone there to pay our respects to Kiri Hume, who is a kaitahu novelist who won the Booker Prize, and she lived in Okarito for many years. So we had a bonfire on the beach and cooked up a kai and honoured her. And while we were there, we were observing the bird life really closely, just seeing what we could see. I don't think we saw kuaka there, but we were just talking before about whether or not they are there at Okaritso. And so I think it's on my list of places to go back to. If anyone wants to go to Okaritso, the old schoolhouse is this magnificent 19th century building that has been turned into a Department of Conservation hut. It sleeps 12, it's right by the beach, it's like $100 a night, and you should go there and you should go and try and find the kuaka for yourselves.
So one thing to add, I think when I first read Paul's book, and in there he talked about culture, he tangata tiriti tēnei tangata, you know, he's a Pākehā, he's from here. He just kind of mentioned in his book there about, you know, a cultural history about these manu. And that piqued my interest. I thought, oh, he's not going to elaborate on that, and I like that. So that kind of set myself up to, I want to find out what that is, because I understand, you know, my culture and our histories and things like that. So I think after he flew off in 2023, I spent the next 6 months until he came back in libraries and archives, you know, talking to people on, you know, calls and stuff like that. I reached out to the Miranda Pūkorokoro Seashore. I reached out to them and I asked them questions because I wanted to know. And in that, it just built this thing up with me, you know, and I fell in love with a bird and his story.
That's gorgeous, thank you. And do we have any more questions from... Oh, yes, okay. Thank you.
I enjoyed so much of the exciting stories as a glaciologist. So my question is very general. Have you ever discussed with the scientists or society about the adaptation or preservation of the disappearance of glaciers?
Oh, does anyone feel equipped to talk about that? Adaptation to the disappearance of... Do you mean like a cultural adaptation?
Yes, cultural or societal.
Where the disappearance of glaciers is making its presence felt, I guess I touched a little bit on in that talk how it's affecting some of our traditional routes through the mountains, and adaptation there can look like going so far, but only so far. So people are travelling from the west coast side up to the pass and then returning, heading back that way, so you can still see down, you can still pay your respects, but it's an imperfect adaptation. But where it's most making its impact felt for us is actually at the coast and with sea level rise. Mai marae, Takutai Tutiti, our marae Aotea, in a big storm, in a storm tide, there are waves breaking across our marae Aotea. And it's right on the beach, and the beach road has been nuked. It's basically been ripped out halfway along, so that road is done. We can still get into the marae from another road, but we are in the process right now of designing and building a new marae. We have to move, so very much on the front lines there, and it's an opportunity as well as a loss for us, because the marae itself was an adaptation. We didn't have the resources to build a marae. We bought the old schoolhouse. It was the native school in Oraka, and it was responsible for the miseducation of generations of our people. And so it was an act of reclamation and adaptation for us in the first place to buy that school and transform it into a marae and a safe place and a place of healing for us. So with the encroaching sea, that's an opportunity for us to kind of dream bigger. And so some of our elders and leaders are leading a process to think, what do we want a marae that's purpose-built for us to look like and feel like? Where are we going to put it? What histories and stories are we going to tell? So I suppose in some ways this change and this sort of attack on our whare is a tragedy, but it's also not. It's also pushing us into getting something that we need and that we want. And it's also starting a process of us thinking about how we story those changes and how our storytelling adapts. And within Kaitahu, we have a different cosmology to a lot of our whanauka up here in the north. the creation story of Ranginui and Papa Tuanuku as the primordial parents, the Sky Father, the Earth Mother. In our cosmology, Ranginui had a first wife. Before Papa Tuanuku, his first wife was Pokuharua Te Pō. And we have a whole kōrero about Papa Tuanuku initially being with Takaroa, with Tangaroa, the god of the sea. So down in the south, the god of the ocean is really significant to us, and there was a big fight between the Sky Father and between Raki and between Takaroa. Sorry, this is very convoluted. It's hard to summarise these things. They're long cycles, but long story short, we have a story about the sea and the land being as one, being a couple, and they were separated, they were broken up. So in a way, we're starting to tell this story of Takaroa coming back to reclaim his first love, who was Papa Tuanuku. So we have older traditions that can help us tell stories about what's happening now and helping us adapt, I guess.
Thank you. We've got another question here.
Kia ora. First of all, ngā mihi nui kia koutou for your mahi, and I really appreciate your kaupapa. I was just wondering if, because I live on the rohi of Ngāti Rehua, Ngāti Waiki Aotea, Motu Aotea, up north, and we are one of the locations that the kuaka come to in the Whangapoa estuary, and the surfers actually are massive drivers because the spit is actually disappearing due to previous farming conditions that have now got sediment coming into the estuary and destroying that spit area really. But there's a lot of bird scientists, environmental scientists, and also local iwi there who are really focusing on individually focusing on helping these kuaka. So I was interested to know whether or not you have any connections to Ngāti Rehua, Ngāti Waiki Aotea, and just because there's so many people on Motu Aotea who are passionate about it, and so I think it's a great opportunity to bring everyone together.
Okay.
It was more of a statement, I suppose. If you are interested in collaborating with other rohi, then other hapu, then I would approach Ngāti Rehua, Ngāti Waiki Aotea.
Kia pai.
Yeah.
Let's talk then.
Great. Something to follow up at morning tea time. Yeah. I want to pick up on a question here, and also something that you were saying earlier, Ali, about the idea of the cryosphere as a whole. So there's a question from Keith Elverson about, is there a coherent imaginary for the cryosphere as a whole? And earlier, Ali, you were asking about to what extent is it helpful to talk about the cryosphere as a whole in a cultural as well as a scientific sense?
Yeah, that's a question that I often ask myself, so I wondered, I thought it would be good to discuss it here. And I know that in polar studies, the idea of the category of the polar when it comes to human aspects is being questioned. Because what does polar mean, in that sense? And certain people would say that polar as a category only makes sense to people who don't live in the polar regions. Because if you live in the Arctic, why would you have anything to do with the Antarctic, which is an unpeopled place? So I think it's not something I necessarily have an answer to, because I think it is a useful category, polar and cryosphere, to talk about, particularly in a period of climate change when the change is affecting people everywhere. But I also think we need to be very careful not to flatten the cryosphere when we use it as a term applied to the human as well as the physical environment. I'd be keen to hear what others think.
I think, Estelle, did you have something you wanted to contribute there? Oh, Billy's got a mic here.
This is something that we do talk about actually in Alaska because we have seen so many changes that are occurring because of things that are happening way down here. And just like, who was it that talked about how we're looking at the world differently, not being separated by the oceans but connected, we keenly feel that. And if you look at examples like the kuaka, the bartail garo, or in my language, churuchbak, you look at whales, you look at these migratory creatures, these migratory relatives that go from one pole to another. They are connected intrinsically. And it's only Western science and Western academia that doesn't understand that. Our worlds as Indigenous peoples are all about relationships. And so those relationships extend farther than the waters that we're familiar with. They extend farther than the pole that my people live in, and they are deeply connected to this other pole. So one of the things that we do is to look for those connections and also people that we can work with in order for us to understand what's happening in our world.
And I guess you've also got a connection that's really impacting now and in the decades to come with Antarctic ice melt, creating sea level rise in the Arctic. Yeah, we've got a question down here.
Yes, thank you all for sharing what you've got here. There's a lot of reading I'd like to do and a waiata I'd like to learn. But this is a question from my perspective. I'm Jasmine. I grew up in Australia, and let's say I went to school in the early 2000s in New South Wales, which is Bundjalung country. I learnt about Antarctica at school as part of the school curriculum. It's my understanding it's still part of the school curriculum. So, Ellie, I was a bit surprised by your results that people don't know and don't understand, because so many of the people who presumably you surveyed learnt that at school. Have you got any thoughts on that?
My understanding is that it's not a compulsory part of the national curriculum. So while in pockets there might be people like yourself who had an education, I don't think that's at all standard. And I don't want to go on and on about the deficit of people, deficit model of people's understanding, but I am always surprised that even educated people seem to have a very limited understanding. You still get the polar bear penguin mistake going on quite a bit. I personally would like to see Antarctica much more embedded in the national curriculum, and not just its physical nature, but the governance structures, and Australia in particular's role in Antarctic governance. I think we need to know so much more about that. And the results that I show aren't that different to results. They're a little bit better, but they're not that different to results in the US. I think they're not that different from results in New Zealand either. Tasmanians do a little bit better than Australians in general when it comes to Antarctica, but again, not all that much, because the Antarctic community is a bit of a bubble. A lot of people know a lot about Antarctica. As soon as you go outside of certain demographic, certain geographical region, people barely hear about the place. So I do think there's a lot more we can do, and I think that stories have got to be a big part of that to interest people, whether we can use literature or other forms of storytelling for people who might not be interested in the science to engage them. So yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
And that makes me think of that recent AI-generated image of Donald Trump holding hands with a penguin and walking towards Greenland.
Yeah. I was hoping you'd bring out the nihilist penguin. Do people know about the nihilist penguin meme? Yeah, and I was going to mention that because that's a good story, a story taken out of context. So it's a clip from a film by Werner Herzog, who was sent down by the US program to Antarctica and produced a documentary, a tiny bit of which is a penguin heading off into the interior. And Herzog says something like, this penguin is deranged and it will soon be dead, in his great accent. But the clip does the opposite, and I think it was originally a kind of, it was produced by some right-wing groups. It's a libertarian kind of thing, like, go your own way, be your own person. But my son mentioned it to me. He said, Mum, finally your research is relevant, because there's this... there's this penguin thing going around, and it's all about motivation and being true to yourself. I'm like, that penguin is deranged. It's going to Australia. So, I mean, the point here, I suppose, that I'm making is that stories, you said long story short, and it just made me think we need the long stories. We need that long story because the short stories, they're too compressed. They don't tell us enough. We need nuance. We don't need headlines. We need long stories. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got an audience question now.
Yeah, I think it's maybe along the same lines. I'm Miriam Schnar. I'm coming from Lund University, Sweden. We do also some media studies around this time on climate change, but across global media. And I wonder if you also come across some themes that are not being told. So in these media headlines, have you reflected on what is not being told? So in our cases, for instance, we find out that the stories linked with adaptation or good stories are not being told. Or like things that's linked with responsibility are not being told. So there's always a disaster news, but the disaster is maybe not climate related, but it's governance related, and that's not so much being told. Did you come across something similar in your work in Antarctica?
Well, if you recall that graph that I showed, certainly I think culpability was right down the bottom, going down. And hope was also right down the bottom, going down. So there are certainly it's been shown that stories that lead with fear get clicked on more often, get shared more often. So there's just this innate, I suppose, nature of the media that sad stories are told more often than happy ones. I mean, it's Tolstoy, I think, who said that first. So we have to think about how to fight stories with stories, how we can create stories that are both attention-grabbing but not necessarily paralysing. I think that's our big challenge. So yes, there are stories that aren't being told, and we need to figure out how to get those into the headlines.
And that does remind me of some research a few years ago. I think it was Rob de Conto's paper about sort of looking at some worst-case scenarios for sea level rise, and the media totally picked up on the worst-case scenario and reported that, whereas another thing the paper was saying was that we can avoid that by doing this. And the way that it was reported was kind of really disappointing to a lot of people, I think. But that makes me just tag into a comment by Daniela that's on the same sort of theme and sort of asking what would a good headline look like?
One that's not written by AI.
And Nic, are you aware that that is a real problem in the media now?
It is. So I also work as a journalist, as a freelancer, and I write a lot for New Zealand Geographic, and there are still humans involved in every step of the process. But other friends who work in newsrooms, there's been a lot of layoffs of sub-editors who traditionally write the headlines, and a lot of that work is being outsourced to AI. And it's pretty obvious what kind of feedback loop we're getting into there, because the AI is trained on the headlines of the past. It knows what is considered a good headline, and it's going to keep producing them. So those imaginaries that are encoded, going right back to the earliest literature about Antarctica and about ice and oceans, have carried through into the human-driven headlines, and the AI, I guess it seems pretty obvious that they're going to be reproducing and amplifying that as we go. I suppose that one of the things that I think a lot about is, as someone who's sort of deeply invested in the power of story, what is the nature of story itself and the impact of story itself changing in this climate, in this world of disposable, attention-grabbing, endless scroll kind of consumption of media? What power do we have to actually bring people in and keep them there and tell them something complex, tell them something nuanced, tell them something that does not just fit within an easy set of categories? And I think that's why continuing to support things like long-form publishing, things like long-form journalism, things like books, things like documentaries, anything that has enough space and scope to actually, get to the depth is so vital. The question of distributing and reaching mass audiences with that is a whole other question as well.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. Getting beyond the headlines is what we really need to do. But I also think, I mean, we weren't interested, Katie might contradict me here, but or Rebecca, you could contradict me too, in looking at what was good and what was bad, you know, because what is good and bad can be different in different circumstances, but rather what imaginary you are buying into. And you might want to buy into the heroic imaginary. If for a certain purpose, you might want to do that. Or you might want to buy into a Gothic imaginary. It depends what your purpose is. So it's not so much what's good and bad, it's what serves your purpose and what doesn't in a particular circumstance. And you have to know in what you're dealing with to make that decision, and that's what I was getting at.
I just want to pick up on a question here from Hannah Nielsen, and then we'll go to an audience question. So, Nic, you've spent a lot of time in the mountains, and Ellie, you've been to Antarctica several times, and Tania, you've spent a lot of time with the kuaka on the coast. How do these embodied experience of these places that you've spoken about shift the way that you conceptualise and conduct your work? How does that change what you do or how you write? How important is that first-hand embodied experience?
I believe, probably culturally, that this manu, AJD, is leading us. He is guiding us in this. You know, we have, Billy pops up with a little idea, you know, we have these little ideas that we kind of discuss, and we think, how are we going to do that? And it happens. It just happens. And, you know, we thank all our atua for that, for, you know, this bird just means so much to us. You know, I have anxiety when I go to Foxton every year, waiting for him, hoping that he is going to turn up, because he is the star of our story. He is the star of our story. And everything that we have done over 3 massive years, and we've had loads of people come, there's just been huge kaupapa. We still believe we put that credit back to the manu. You know, it's not about us. We are just the vehicles. You know, the manu just drops a paddle in this waka and he drops a paddle in that waka, and our job is just to row it. You know, that's how we're just doing it. There's nothing planned. We don't have a little wee list of the 1, 2, 3s. Sometimes it might be 1, 7, 6, 4. But that's the way that AJD does that for us. I think in Paul's book, if you have a look at his book, he talks about AJD as his friend. He's a friend. So he's not just another bird that's flying around, he's a friend. And I never ever believed, just the thought of having this passion for one tiny little creature would just open up my world. It was nothing that was ever in my scope. And, you know, I do my karakia and I do my ruruku and I go down to the estuary and I sing. I sing down there, you know. It's all about that, the Māori that's in there and sharing that wairua with these manu. We had one of our girls, and she is just amazing with her reo pōpuri, her karanga. And you know, if you're a bird watcher or, you know, a birder, you kind of go and you've got to kind of creep down and you take it slow. No, she walked out there into the water. There was a cluster of kuaka that were just there, and she did this amazing karanga. And Paula's going, oh, she's going to scare them away. And they just kind of looked at her. We were just like awestruck at the fact that they just kind of looked at her. They didn't move. And then when she finished, and she can do long karanga, when she finished, she just kind of walked back onto land, and they just kind of went, and just kept on eating. So, yeah, I believe we are guided by this bird. He is the one that is leading us. Yeah, koira.
Nic, your account of your walks in the mountains are very embodied. It was cold, it was sometimes dangerous, sometimes there were falls. How important was that to you, or how much did that impact the way that you told the story?
what I really wanted to do was try and take the stories that were in the archive and take them back out into the places where they happened. And I strongly believe that things happen when you are in the place, and just to physically be on the whenua, to have your feet on the ground, to have the rivers flowing through your boots and the leaves tangled in your hair. Not that I've got any hair left, but anyway, just the process of physically being there is kind of everything to me. And partly it's, I guess, because you're trying to convey information, just in its purest sense. You're trying to convey complexity and detail about these landscapes. And the further the distance you are from them, the more flattened they become, the more likely you are to reach for truisms or cliches or, it's a mountain valley. It's the same as any other mountain valley. So just being there is a way of actually feeling the place, feeling the wairua, feeling the connection to the ancestors who were there, and starting to physically read the landscape in a different way. Because, when you are normally in the mountains, you're on a mission, you're going from A to B, this is your route. Whereas a lot of these walks for me were much more intuitive about trying to figure out where would the stopping places and the camping places be, knowing that from oral maps we have a name for this valley, this is the name, this is the topography, where exactly might that place have attached to. So you start to get a feel for where the camping spots were, where is flat ground that's sheltered from the prevailing winds, where is the dense forest with bird resources, where does it give you fresh water. I spent a couple of days out with our rock art experts who know where the caves are that have the art, and you start picking up on that. Where are they likely to be? Because there are patterns, and it's to do with the way that the ancestors were moving through that landscape and surviving from that landscape. So partly it was about having that embodied experience to try and get yourself closer to the people who were there before. It also is a writing technique. One of the real challenges of writing the book that I ended up writing is not 200,000 words, but it's still a really fat book. How do you make it specific? How do you keep people interested? How do you keep them reading? And when you're in a place with people, you smell, you hear, you feel, you have access to so much more information, so much more richness and depth. And, when at New Zealand Geographic, new writers come on board, they get given a kind of hierarchy of sources, and at the very top of that hierarchy is going to the place where it happened with the people who were there. So whatever it is that you're reporting, being there on the ground, in the field, that's the key thing. At the bottom is, of course, an AI query, because that's as removed and kind of stripped out of all meaning and specificity. Being in place for me is a methodology, and I guess from the point of view of writing, it gives you something that you just can't get any other way.
I think we've just got a few minutes left, but we've got an audience question.
Kia ora, this might be too long-winded of a question for the time left, but it's for Nic. I wondered I want to know more about how you felt being up there in the mountains on those ancestral routes, and I suppose I can read about this in your book, and we all can, which I'm excited to read, but particularly in the context of the loss of the glaciers and the ice up there and the changing and the loss of that particular route. You mentioned that just can't be traversed anymore. How does it feel for you being up there? Thank you.
Very quickly, I'm aware that we're running out of time, but I felt all the feels, all the things. At times I was deeply bored, because I was retracing traditional routes. When you're doing modern tramping, you drive to the start of the good bit, and then you do the walk, and then you drive home. Whereas because I was trying to retrace more traditional routes, it's long river valleys, days of travel up river valleys and out to the coast. So at times I was extremely bored. At times I was terrified. I got myself at times in situations that I probably shouldn't have got myself in, the most notable one being a solo winter crossing of the Southern Alps, when I misjudged the conditions and triggered an avalanche and had to get rescued by a helicopter. which I would not recommend as a writing technique. Probably not the best way to get material. At times I felt spiritually enriched and uplifted and connected. At times I felt uncertain and unsafe. I did a one walk. I trespassed the entire way to Arthur's Pass. I created a route that only went on private farmland to try and recreate the feeling of my ancestors when we went from having total reign and ownership of those lands to becoming trespassers on our own land. So I wanted to know what that felt like. So trespassing, at times, yeah, so all the feels. But the climate side of it, I guess I felt enough about that I wrote another book about it. So Little Doomsdays is really addressing that question of how do we feel and how have other civilizations felt about crises like this. So yeah, we can talk about it later. Kia ora.
Kia ora, and thank you all to our wonderful panellists, and I'm sorry to the people whose questions I didn't get a chance to ask. I've got a little koha for everyone, but in the meantime, please give a huge round of applause to our speakers.